I think I can jog you through it in a reasonable amount of time, and I think it'd be useful to have on tape, because I'll tell people, and then they'll, it's hard to retain. We have a ton, which I'll talk about. We have a ton of family materials that my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, accumulated. And so, for example, one of the cool things we have, the earliest Price is Stephen Price, and he was a Revolutionary War soldier, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they have, from the DAR, my great uncle got back in like 1905 or something. He got the records. You get a sheet about his activity during the war, and it blows your mind. So I'll talk about that. I mean, I'll give a little, if that's what you want to do.
Well, here's what
thumbnail sketch.
First of all, we're going to have a little Tom Price arc, Then we'll segue into the Price family history arc.
Okay, sure.
It's this logical thing given the composite. And so,
right?
Well, most people want to know, who are you?
Well, I can at least do that too.
Exactly.
Okay.
So here we are, Tom Price. Thank you very much. Tell me a little bit about your mom and dad.
Okay. Petey and Sam. My mother's name was actually Martha Jane, and so was, there were three lines. My grandmother was Martha Jane, my mom was Martha Jane, my sister was Martha Jane, but my mother was always known as Petey from a little girl, because the joke goes that my grandfather, who was Stub Tinkham, Norman Tinkham, was kind of hoping for at least one boy, right, because he loved sports. So he used to call my mother Pete, as opposed to Martha, and even to the point that he would teaching her to do things sports-wise, and she said that he would teach me to play catch. He wanted to have someone to play catch with, and sure enough, I broke my thumb on a hard throw. So he stopped doing that. But so mom and dad, Petey was born 1926. My dad, Samuel Penfield Price, was born in 1921. And they grew up within 5-minute walk of each other, but didn't know each other growing up. My grandparents, the Prices, grew up. The Prices were on Crosman, and then my mother was on 934 Lakeview across from the cemetery. So that was just a short walk. But the families never really knew each other, as far as I know. And so my dad was 1921, and he did meet the family when he got to be in college. I don't know how they met, but he met and started dating my mother's older sister, who was Nancy. So my mother had two sisters, Nancy and then a younger sister, Mamie, Mary, known as Mamie. And so my dad, he went to college at Amherst, and at some point along the line, during his college career, Nancy was born in 1923, I think, so they were a couple years younger. But they went out for about a year and were dating pretty heavily. And my dad, he graduated from high school in 1939, went to Amherst, and the war broke out. And he enlisted, and they had a program. He went to school in the summer and learned cryptography, and then by 1943 was in the war, and he finished early. I think he graduated he got his graduation. They didn't have a graduation ceremony, but he went off to war. My mother, meanwhile, during the war, she was in prep school down in Virginia, a place called Chatham Hall. And 5 years difference between them in age, but because her sister was dating Sam Price, and he went off to war, she, one way or the other, asked if she could write him letters. And we have those letters. And the first letter, which is, because at the time, Nancy was the girlfriend when he went off to war, and pretty serious, not engaged. And the first letter, she says, I understand that soldier boys like to get letters from home, so you're the only soldier boy I know, so I'm going to write you. And so his letters back to her don't survive. Letters that she wrote to him do survive, as far as most of them. And just to kind of jump ahead of the story a little bit, during the war, as we all know, Jamestown sort of burgeoned its manufacturing, and imports coming in and getting involved. And in the, and I can't remember the names of all these companies, but there was an airline parts company. It would have been I don't know what the name of it was, but they were, Jamestown, had a lot of manufacturing. And there was an executive came and worked for one of the companies here during the summer as the people took on staff because of all the demand for whatever they needed. And he was from Louisiana. Jim, can't remember his last name. Doesn't matter. So Nancy, like a lot of women during the war, went to work. She's, we've got to contribute to the war effort. So she became his executive secretary up there in Airport Hill somewhere, I think. And they fell in love. So my dad got a classic Dear John letter from Nancy. So that was that. But the letters from Petey kept coming. Mm-hmm. And and she even wrote the letter. She said it was a difficult letter to write about the wedding of Nancy with this guy, which was a small wedding in Washington, D.C. Not necessarily relevant, but during the war, so much happened to people that my grandfather, who was an architect, was called to Washington to help with some sort of a war effort, in some department. I don't know the whole. I'd like to learn more about that. But they were in D.C. They left their house in Jamestown and spent at least a year in D.C. During the war. So Petey and Sam got he wrote and he knew her. So when the war started, when he went off to war, she would have been 17 years old, and just a kid going to prep school. By the time he came home after the summer of 1945, she was now 19, and they looked each other up, of course, and wanted to thank her for all those letters.
What a guy.
And she had turned into a beautiful, of course, young woman, and they hit it off immediately and started going out. My dad he said later, because he always said he wasn't somebody that made decisions necessarily really quickly. He sort of would mull things over. But he said, one thing I did really quickly that made a lot of sense was, because he was coming back to the country, he was stationed, his ship, the Ancon, was in the, the campaigns in the Pacific at the very end of the war. And he ended up with a medical condition. He basically had some sort of what they call a jungle rot or something. His skin broke out all over his body, so he was actually relieved. He was in a hospital for a while there. Although he said it was an outdoor hospital, and the nurses were very nice, and it was not, he was uncomfortable. He wasn't, he felt kind of badly. They said, no, he can't have you because it might be catching. So he was, anyway. So then, before you knew it, they decided to discharge him. And as he was coming back across the Pacific towards San Francisco, the bomb was dropped. Mm. And so he was actually on board when he heard that, and the war was over with Japan. I think it was August, wasn't it?
Right.
So he gets back to San Francisco, and he says, "Okay, the war is over." Because he's thinking, "Well, I'm going to be, I'm not sure whether it was an absolute discharge, but he was thinking, maybe I'll get back. Who knows? Who knows how long the war is going to go on?" But once it was over, he gets back to San Francisco, and now it's late, August sometime, and he says, "I really want to go to school. I don't have much time." So he contacted Yale, and he found they were giving an exam. They were the first to do entrance exams, apparently, and they were giving an exam, and he hightailed it across the country to take that exam. So he found himself in New Haven, taking an exam. I think that's what he did. And before he even went home, I think, or he got there and quickly took the exam and passed and got accepted to Yale. And he said he was lucky because he was right ahead of that wave of people coming back,
Right.
when the war was over. He was sort of the thin edge of the wedge there, and he got lucky. So he got admitted to Yale and went right to school that fall. And anyway, connected with Mom, and they got engaged the following spring. And they got married the following fall on my birthday, which was great. October 12th was when they got married. I was born 6 years later. And then Dad, his father, Wilson Price, had a law practice in Jamestown. It was called Price and Miller at that time. Walter Miller was his partner. And Charlie Price was, I'm not sure his exact timing, but when the war was over, he got married pretty quickly. started working for Price and Miller. My dad finished law school. I think Charlie went to Cornell. Anyway, they staggered a little bit, but my dad that was going to be his. Probably, he said it wasn't certain. I'm not sure if you ever got this when you talked to my dad, but he went to Yale Law School, and there was a chance. He said there was an outside. He thought about maybe going to New York or someplace with this degree, because he actually liked law school and liked the law, but he ended up saying, well, by that time he was engaged to be married. They got married in 1946. And so they were in law school together for a while, and then he got out in 1940, would have been 48, 48, came back and worked for his dad. So they had Charlie, Walter Miller, my grandfather, Wilson Price, and my father. And they bought a house on the GI Bill in 1948 and started a family in that year, actually, 1948, where my brother Clark was born in 1948. So Petey and Sam raised 6 kids, ranging from Clark in 1948 to Norman in 1963, 15 years between them, and were married for almost 67 years. Until my mom's death in October of 2013, they were 1 week shy of 67 years married.
Fantastic.
Great couple.
So your dad came back and worked at the local law firm of Price and Miller, which is Wilson C. Price, which is his dad. And I recall there's quite a story, and it dealt with Stanford.
Yeah, it's an interesting story.
Yeah, so tell the story for our law brethren, because
it's kind of neat. Little background. The family, just briefly, the Prices ended up in Chautauqua County like in the 1830s, so they came here pretty early. They were originally, the original one, I'll just briefly say, was the earliest one we know about is a guy named Stephen Price, who was from New Jersey. That's at least where it's enlisted in the Continental Army in 1776, I think. And he was in the 3rd New Jersey Regiment, was there throughout the war, managed to survive. There was an indication he had some sort of a precursor of the Purple Heart, but I don't know. So he might have had some sort of a wound, but I'm not sure what it was. But he fought, he was in all sorts of engagements. So that'll come, maybe get to that later. But so Stephen Price, as a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers did, they got patents in lieu of cash, after the war was over. And if you
patents really being
land patents, yeah. You'd get 50 acres or whatever it was. And it was super common. And so, I researched it once, and I couldn't confirm that was because what happened after the war, Stephen Price moved to Cortland County and settled there. But it's interesting, I went to his grave site with my brothers last summer, and sure enough, there was a historical marker saying that Cortland County, and this was right near Homer, New York, which is in Cortland County, was known for a destination and a lot of it was largely settled by Revolutionary War, or at least there were a lot of them that settled there, and many people buried in that cemetery came to Cortland County based on patents, letters of patent from the state, from the USA rather, giving them land. And interestingly, just real quickly an aside on that, I read somewhere that a lot of those patents never were redeemed. Essentially, they were sold. That you get these rather sharp people would go to the taverns, let's say, and say, "Who's got a patent?" Whatever, and they would give them 10 cents on the day, and that's swampland or whatever, right? Well, anyway, this Stephen Price, he got to Cortland County, had land there. I did find that the property once a long time ago, and he married the captain's daughter from his regiment, named Elizabeth Hall. They got married, and they had 12 children. The oldest one, Charles, the first Charles Price, was born in 1786. He's buried in the Lakeview Cemetery, and his wife, Polly. They lived in Cortland, on Homer. They got married there in like 1809 or something, and then they migrated to Cattaraugus County. I don't know much about that, but they ended up in Chautauqua County. They were the first ones to come to Chautauqua County. They ended up with 10 children. Now, these are non-Catholics. They were all Baptists. But Charles was the oldest, of the 12. And then he got married to Polly, and they had 10 children. And briefly, the two that I know about are Wilson Andrews Price and his brother Addison Abrams Price. They were like 2 years apart, 1814, 1816. And they went into business together. They were builders in Jamestown. In fact, I'm told that if you go to Bemis Point, the church there was built by them, and someone said they built schools, churches, houses throughout the 1800s. And they were both big, tall, strapping guys. And their dad was also, when you look at a census, he was also listed as what they used to call a joiner, meaning a carpenter. So they settled in Jamestown. I'm not sure exact date, 1830s, let's say. And then the family started to develop. Addison Price, by the way, his forebears, descendants, I should say, one of them, who you'll know, is Susan Price, who's married to Rob Churchill. She's from that. She was Susan Price from the Addison Price line, going way back. And then the Wilson Price line is Wilson Andrews Price. Was the first Wilson, and named after a friend of theirs named Wilson Andrews, I found out. But anyway, so Wilson Andrews Price, married a gal who was from Asheville named Amy Butler. They got married in 1840. She was born 1820. She died in 1926, so we could come back to, she almost made 106 years old. But so Wilson Andrews Price marries Amy Butler. And they had, they think as far as I can tell from family records, they lost a few in childbirth or, early, but they had one surviving child, Charles Harrison Price. Only child they had that survived to adulthood. And Charles Harrison Price was named Charles Harrison because of William Henry Harrison. Because he was born the year Harrison was elected, he was born 1841. And he was named in honor. And he actually had a cousin named Henry Clay Price. So they were into the politics, I guess. But anyway, so anyway, Charles Harrison Price was the only child. And and Amy Butler was about tiny. She was like 4'10" or something. She married this big, tall guy, well over 6 feet tall. So I'm a classic case where I split the difference, right, in the price. Are you the butler or the prices? And but they had this one child, and just as an interesting thing for the family, he kept a diary, Charles Harrison Price, from 1861 to 1865. I have those diaries, and he was so he started them when he was 20. The war breaks out. First thing in his diary, though, I'll tell you, this is kind of for Jamestown people. Right next to the pub in Jamestown, and there's a plaque, or a historical marker, that talks about the Great Fire of 1861. Not many people necessarily know about that, and it was January of 1861. It took a couple blocks in Jamestown. I'm not sure how it started, but it was a big deal. Well, I have independent reference to that. His diary opens up essentially, of course, January of 1861, and a few pages into it, the fire.
Okay.
And he said the alarm went up, and at the time he was living on 5th Street in town here, right where the Moose Club in that area used to be. And that's where this house is still there. It's probably built in the 1840s or something. But so he says the alarm went out, and everyone descended on the downtown Jamestown to get in the bucket brigade and so on. And so that's what he talked about that. And so the diaries are interesting throughout because he talks about the war, about Gettysburg, about the assassination of Lincoln. So that's kind of a nice family record that he was pretty faithful keeping that diary. And he ended up getting married to a local girl named Mary Bell Kimberly. When they're looking at the atlas, they lived around the corner. So they were like this neighborhood girl that he met. And she was about 5 years younger, and they got married. And it took a while, but they had 3 children, 3 boys. And the oldest was my grandfather, Wilson Price. He was born on July 3rd, 1875. He used to like to say, I was 1 year old when Custer's last stand took place. So he was born in 1875. Then he had a next brother came along with Albert Price, who was stayed in Jamestown and was very very close to the family. And he was born in 1878, and then there was an 1881 son named Ernest, who, after he graduated from Cornell, moved out west, ended up in Spokane, Washington, was an architect. Never met him, but we used to get letters and stuff. But so we have three boys: Wilson, and his dad was Charles Harrison Price. Charles Harrison Price, in his diaries, indicates that he was sort of in what we'd call now a book club. He talked about the books he read. He would list, we were talking about, we read Julius Caesar, we read Moby Dick, whatever. So, so he was a reader, but never had the opportunity to go to college or anything. And so he ended up working, as he called it in the Atlas, it would say, or in the city records, it would say, as a printer. So he was a printer for the old, they called it the Jamestown Journal in those days. So that was where he worked. And he, but he had, you could tell he had self-educated type of guy. So my grandfather, Wilson, his name was Wilson Clark Price, rather than Wilson Andrews Price, because Clark was another a family name. He was a good student. The saying, the statement is, as well, I guess, everyone says he could not pound a nail in straight. He was not going to go into the family business of building anything. So, but he was a good student, and he graduated from Jamestown High School in 1893. And he, at the time, I forget how big the classes were. They were relatively small, obviously, but he did well, and he was, academically oriented. So Wilson Price and two buddies of his researched colleges. And there was a guy named Arthur Lake, whose father was in the railroad business. Then there was a cousin of his named Ned Green. Edward Green, rather. Edward Green. Ned was Edward Green's son. So anyway, they researched, long story short, they researched colleges and came across a almost newly minted university no one had ever heard of called Stanford. And they said, well, that's interesting. Stanford was founded by Leland Stanford Sr., and it was in honor of his deceased teenage son, Leland Stanford Jr., only child of the Stanford family. He was a railroad baron, like, I forget which railroad, but he Southern Pacific or something like that. He was from out West Coast, obviously. And he died in like 1888 with like an estate of something like $50 million with no estate tax. And you imagine what $50 million in those days would have bought you. So long story short, he and his wife, before his death, decided they were going to leave their money for the purpose of founding a university. They were going to buy land in Palo Alto and found a university on progressive lines, actually. There's reports that they visited with President Eliot of Harvard. They were trying to come up with ideas. They wanted to be sort of progressive. They didn't want to have necessarily try to copy the Ivies. So apparently it was their purpose to keep tuition as low as possible, maybe even free at the beginning, for students to try to encourage matriculation. And so as I understand it, my grandfather and his two friends were able to, they say, hey, we can go to this new school that no one ever heard of essentially for room and board. And Arthur Lake's father got them passage for free to the university. And sure enough, the parents said, fine. I always think back, the key person in our family in a way is that Charles Harrison Price, the printer from Jamestown. I've got information about him, independent evidence. He was a very nice man, a good guy. And but to let his kid go to college out in the West Coast, with whatever expense, and risk. And two quick stories about that. My grandfather said that when he was on the train platform down here, the train station I think was from 1860, so he left from Jamestown with his trunk, and his grandfather, who would have been the builder, this guy Wilson Andrews Price, said that he said by that time he you know, he was sort of this tall, bearded guy. And he said, he gave me this big hug, and I looked up and he had tears streaming down his face, saying, "My boy, I may never see you again because you're going out west." And my grandfather points out in the 1890s, every so often there were still some little rearguard actions from the Native Americans. There would, people, there'd be some sort of a holdup, and people get shot and killed, the trains or whatever. So there was that issue. And the other issue is we were wondering about money, a little bit. The family was nice middle class, and they're doing okay, but, well, just a brief thing, the prices, fortunately, had sort of a fortunate thing happen. When oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, there was a bit of a run up here in western New York. Thinking, well, if it's close enough, right? So there was some speculation. I'd like to learn more about that. I don't know much about it, except when I was researching the family, I found an oil lease that that I think both Wilson and Addison were on with a third party that helped. That they bought this lease, or they took out a lease, and it was quickly assigned to investors from New York City. I don't know how it all worked. It was kind of funny, but the consideration was $10,000.
Oh, then.
And it was in 1865.
Wow.
And so there was 10 grand that they split up, which would have been really a nice piece. But I'm not aware that they did anything else like that. But so I think they had a little bit of that. Might have been helpful to have. In fact, there's evidence that they always had some income from some. And that not around here because they didn't really have oil here, but. They did use some of the money to invest in Pennsylvania. I have not researched that, but they always talked about having some oil. They would check on their leases down in Pennsylvania, but they never made. It wasn't like they struck it rich, but they had some extra cash. So anyway, Wilson goes to this new school, Stanford, and absolutely loved it. He loved it. He didn't come back till the following June. His cousin Edward Green didn't like it, and dropped out, went to Harvard. Arthur Lake, I think, stuck it out. And one kind of neat thing in the family is that my grandfather wrote, especially freshman year, wrote a lot of letters home. And his younger brother, true to form, Albert, who was our archivist and family historian par excellence, he saved every darn letter. And I found, it goes back 20 years, we're going through the notebooks, we've got all these black notebooks up in my dad's library, going through these notebooks, and there was just like on the outside it said something like Stanford or, maybe just WCP for my grandfather, college or something. So I opened them up, and the original envelopes, what he did, he put the letters back in the envelopes and pasted them in this notebook. And there was page after page. I was pulling them out, they were like nothing, no wear and tear on them at all. Yeah. So I transcribed them. I've got them somewhere, in my records. 50 pages, ended up being double spaced, of letters from Stanford. And I'd say maybe 40 from the first 2 years, and then it drops off after that. But fascinating to me. And then we also have clippings that when he was going to Stanford, he took a great interest in San Francisco as a city, and he visited it many times, pre-Quake, of course. And he would write articles to the Post-Journal, and they'd publish them, about his trips to San Francisco. Okay. Chinatown, he've got things on, Wilson Price in Chinatown at 20 years old. And Wilson Price, he took a great interest. He loved the West. In fact, he took my grandmother there on their honeymoon. They went across country and ended up he went ashore Palo Alto. So he went to Stanford, and then he got out in 1897 and went to Harvard Law School. Kind of a neat thing, I went through some boxes of his stuff in his attic. Probably wasn't saved, but it was his notebooks from law school. And they had these types of notebooks where you'd go like this, and you flip the top off, and you'd be writing, so that kind of notebook. And there were a couple dozen of them. And I recognized some of the names of his professors because they later wrote these treatises that became, it was like Corwin on contracts or something, right? And then there were all these editions, 20th edition, which we would have probably read the same thing where they added to them. But originally, a guy named Corwin, who was a Harvard professor, which Wilson Price had, I was his teacher. That kind of thing. It's kind of neat. Wish I'd saved all those, or maybe they're someplace. Anyway, he got out of Harvard and came back to Jamestown. There was never any question about that. He was coming back to Jamestown. and he would have been 25. There was a guy by the name of Frank Stevens, who was a prominent lawyer. And when I looked at they had a program from his high school graduation. Frank Stevens was one that handed out the prizes. So he would have handed out a prize to my grandfather, whatever it was, he got a prize, academic prize. So all those years later, he comes back and he's hired by this Frank Stevens as a right out of law school. And he works for him for like 5 years or so. And then he was hired by the state public service commissioner, one of those state agencies. He became the lawyer. And so my grandfather, when he was like 30, was on his own as a solo practitioner. And so, and he was a confirmed bachelor. The family lived on the corner of, well, in between, it was facing Lakeview, in between Crosman and Van Buren, had a big house which was torn down in the late 30s. But it was, one of these big sort of rambling, houses. And it had all these generations in it. It had the grandma and the parents and the kids. And there's so he was, when he got this job, he said, well, I would just take the trolley into town every day, and I'd come back and get this great home cooked meal. My parents were there, my grandfather was there, my grandmother was there, and he never, for many years, it took him 15 years to end up getting married. So that's sort of a little background about how the lawyer thing started. He was the first one to go to college, and then he went on to law school and started at the.
So he's a sole practitioner, but at some point, did he bring in anybody to work with him?
Yes. What they did is, the practice in those days was you'd have people clerk for you, and then you let them go. A lot of times, you might want to take somebody, you'd say. But it was understood that it wasn't a failure to be said, okay, you've clerked for me for a couple of years, you could have learned the ropes, and good luck. Well, let me fast forward. In 1966, my grandfather died at just almost 91 years old. And I was almost 14 years old. And I'm so pleased he did this. My father took me to his memorial, Bar Association Memorial, which was held in the crypt of St. Luke's Church.
Wow.
Never forget it. My dad said, "Why don't you come along?" Right? So we got coat and tie on and went to this thing, and we'll never forget it because it was so neat. It's precursor of what you do, and I don't know to what extent they did it for everybody, but my grandfather, not bragging about him, I'm very proud of him. He was, the day after he died, he was the editorial in the newspaper was about him. It wasn't, it was just an obit, but it was editorial. So I went to the memorial of my dad. It was just, again, a men's, it was all these attorneys. It was probably, so 1966. And so they'd get up and talk, and I don't remember much about what they said, except guy got up, got a big laugh, because he had clerked for my grandfather, he said. And he said that Wilson Price, a soft-spoken man, but one day he told me he'd like to see me in his office. And that wasn't a good sign. So I went in, as the speaker said, I went in and sat down, and Wilson Price sort of looked at me very, it was kind of nice, calm, and said, I have to tell you, there's not going to be a great future for attorneys who drink during the day. It was Willard Cass Sr.
No kidding.
He clerked for my grandfather, and but he'd go to, as a lot of people did, they'd have 2 martini lunch, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And so he was, and my grandfather, he was not against alcohol. I mean, he drank a little, he'd have, whatever, cocktail, but it wasn't that. It was, he said something like, I'm not sure that there's a bright future ahead for an attorney that drinks during the day. So, and we could probably think of examples. But so Willard Cass Sr. was released into the world, saying, and I think it might have been a close call. I don't know, maybe that was part of it, but it wasn't like he was dismissed. It was just like, word to the wise, it's not during the day. So Walter Miller comes along. And Walter started with my grandfather in 1927, when my grandfather was 52 years old. And it was a great match. It was a great match. Walter, I think, he was from a family with no money in Jamestown. And I can't remember whether he went to college or just went right to law school. In those days, I don't know, but he was excellent lawyer, and and I went to his the 50th anniversary of his admission to the bar in 1977. I still remember that, up the Sportsman's Club, and he had a nice thing to say. Just a little bit about my grandfather's brother, Albert. Albert remained a confirmed bachelor for his whole life, and my grandfather obviously got married in 1915. Finally, to my grandmother Theo Penfield, but Albert was very close to my grandfather, and he worked for the electric company for a while. He did other things, but then eventually he gravitated towards the law, towards the practice, of law, and working with my grandfather in his office as the younger brother, paralegal. Kind of like an Art Laudenslager for the Wright family, and my grandfather would occasionally nudge him and say, "Look, you've been doing this for 5-10 years. Just take the bar, get admitted, because you can do that. You don't have to go to law school." And he always said, "Nope, happy doing what I'm doing."
Isn't that interesting?
He was very happy examining titles, doing estate accountings, doing all and just doing a lot of stuff. Very bright guy, Cornell graduate, and really. He was very academic, but he had no interest in. And my grandfather, I'm not sure if my dad or my grandfather said that he didn't want that responsibility of pulling the trigger, giving opinions. He was glad to be the support.
Yeah.
My grandfather, which he did for many, many years, and so he, so he was working there when and I think by the time my dad came along, he was probably still there. But he was he lived right across the orchard. He was on Van Buren and right across the orchard from my grandparents, and was a constant figure. My dad said he was their television set, because he was the one that would come over and read after dinner. He had a beautiful reading voice and read them Treasure Island and Tale of Two Cities. And he said, in the 30s, before there was any television, there was radio, of course, but we would just be. Uncle Bert would come over across the orchard and he'd read to us night after night. So he was a great guy. I'm sorry I never met him. He died in 1955. He had some complications of an illness of some sort in his late 70s. So that's sort of a summary of how the law stuff started. So Charlie Price came back. My dad came back. They worked with Walter Miller. They really liked, Walter was very welcoming to them. And the firm, my grandfather, like a lot of lawyers in those days, maybe worked, because that's what he did. He worked up until, he would actually come to the office pretty much, not until he died, but probably into his maybe 80 years old. But my dad said it was great being able to work with him, because he had that experience, and he, particularly was solid in things like banking, and he was on a lot of boards and that sort of thing. So he sort of paved the way for their professional career. And then, so just quickly on to me. So one of 6 kids, and I'm third in line. My older brother, Clark, went to Stanford. What was kind of neat was my brother got admitted to Stanford the spring before my grandfather died that summer. So he was very, very pleased that he'd gotten into his old school, was going to go to his old school there. And Clark became an engineer, environmental engineer, no interest in law. He went to the Coast Guard, and then he went to, he got his, I think he had a 5-year program at Stanford, actually, and got his degree. But anyway, my sister Marty, and then I came along and ended up in law school. I don't know if it was by default. Didn't know what else to do, sometimes. I went to seminary for 2 years for academic reasons, not for the ministry. It was a Protestant seminary called Colgate Rochester in Rochester after college, and then got married in the middle of that, and said I'm not sure I'm going to teach religion, so applied to and got into Washington Lee University in 1976, and ended up, and then my brother Sam, who had, I think, more of maybe a vocation for the law right from the start. I think he was interested from the start. Ended up going to the same law school, and the two of us, we never got to work together because he came back and worked for the firm. But so that's sort of a little background. Is that good stopping point for an hour?
Well, just probably wrap up the Price-Miller chronology for those who won't know, other than
Sure.
maybe you or me. But certainly, at the time, it's Wilson Price Senior or Junior. Really, Wilson Price.
He was just Wilson.
Wilson
Well,
Price.
Wilson C. Price. Interesting. Well, just quickly to clear that up, my cousin Tripp Price, who is Charlie's oldest, he was Wilson Clark Price. My grandfather was Wilson Clark Price, but the great great grandfather was Wilson Andrews Price.
Oh, okay.
Wilson. Okay, and so who cares? So it was technically he wasn't the third, but they called him Tripp, and it made perfect sense. And he was always known as Tripp. So yeah, so Wilson Price started practicing in 1900, right on the nose, and probably had his own practice by like 1905 after the senior guy went to the state, worked for the state. So Frank Stevens. So then he worked by himself for about 20 years, and then a little over. Then Walter came in, and again worked in depth, and then through his retirement, and then Charlie and Sam. So that was, and then the firm expanded in the 70s. I don't know the exact dates. That's where we needed Tom Flowers, because Tom Flowers came into the firm, and great addition to the firm. They thought very highly of Tom, and so it was Price, Miller, and Flowers, and then Bill Evans. I can't quite remember who was first. I think maybe Tom Flowers and then Bill, but I'm not positive. I should know that. Then Bill Evans, our Floridian, came up. He married a Jamestown girl, I think, or late Jamestown, I think was Carol. So it was Price, Miller, Evans, and Flowers for many years, and then Bill, after practicing law for in fact, he was there. I got out of law school in '79. And started with my dad in '80, in January of '80, and so Bill was certainly still there, and he was sort of mentored me. Charlie did, and Bill did. I had the office next to Bill, and then eventually Bill, took the path of business, Pizza Huts, and but Bill always said something interesting. He said my training as a lawyer worked wonders for my business career. He said it was a great background to have, and he always spoke highly of my family, the family firm, and it was a good experience. But Tom Flowers was there till he retired, and super lawyer. Then Sammy came into the firm.
When did Tripp come in?
That's a great question. It's a great question.
He was here when I came, and I came in '76.
Well, he was already here. Yeah. Tripp. It's a good question.
He was the son of
Charlie. He was the oldest of three boys, and none of the others went into law. But Tripp had a passion. He really wanted to practice law, and I think it's Tripp had some academic it was struggles. I think he might have had some dyslexia. I'm not really sure, but he really worked his butt off. He was a hard worker, really wanted to be a lawyer, and he really encouraged me. I'm not ashamed to say I flunked the bar twice. Finally passed it, and the reason I took it a third time in a way was because Tripp said, "Just take it again. You'll be fine." And I did, and I passed. And Tripp was, he was very good that way. He loved practicing law, I think, and but I don't know exactly when he came in to the firm. So
around that time period, we're
would have been mid '70s, early '70s, yeah. Because he went to law school out west. He went in Spokane. I think he went to Gonzaga. I think that was the law school he went to. In fact, while he was out there, just a side note, that third brother, my grandfather's youngest brother, Ernest, who was an architect out there, was well up into his 90s. And Tripp, and I think his wife was still alive too, Jessie. And I think Tripp he was there, I think, when they passed away, and he actually got to know them, and even I think got involved somewhat in their estate proceeding. So it was kind of a neat thing that he was out there. They had some family out there at the end of their lives because their daughter had died earlier. So by the time I got there in '80, I was there for 2 years, and And then I had the opportunity to go to the Chautauqua Abstract to be, they wanted an in-house counsel. Title insurance was just sort of starting in our community. I mean, been around a long time, but it had been no one was interested in title insurance here because we had a real tradition of attorney examinations and opinions. And it started to come in the 80s because banks were desiring a secondary mortgage market, et cetera. And so it was perfect. I was very fortunate. In 1982, I moved over to Chautauqua Abstract Company. I took a job up there as an in-house attorney because when they were getting orders for title insurance, they were farming them out to people like Bart Shack and Al Larita, who were doing a lot of the exams, and great guys, great at examining counsel. But they said maybe we can get somebody, a young buck, to come in, a young guy, come in and do this for us. And so I got hired in '82. This is thanks to Bill Evans, who's told me this story, and it was very kind of heartwarming in a way, or gratifying. When Bill first came to the firm, again in the '70s sometime, not sure exactly when, and he worked with Charlie and my dad Sam, and they had the practice of having a Wednesday morning firm meeting every week. There's 8 o'clock in the morning, and to kind of what are we doing, who's working on what, and sort of maybe just to have a communal chat about how things are going in various cases that they're working on. So Bill said at that time, he's always been sort of a go-getter, and he would find these meetings to be a little bit, a drag. And so he said, early on, he said, it happened, in one particular case, they had the meeting, and they're about to break it up, and he looks over at my dad, it was his characteristic thing. He was kind of going like this, like my dad would take his glasses off, put them up here, and he'd rubbing his eyes. He's thinking, right? And everyone said, oh, Sam's thinking. So everyone sort of sat down, and Bill was like, he says, I was kind of like, oh, come on, let's go back to work, get to our desk. And then he said, then your dad said, about that particular case that someone had talked about, I'm not so sure that's the way to go. Why don't we, And he brought up a couple things that no one had thought of. And it made some sense. Maybe we shouldn't say this or conclude that or make that offer or whatever it was. And Bill, he was very sweet. He said, I never was impatient with your father ever again. Because, so it's kind of a nice lawyer's thing. Because my dad was like that type of person that was, the wheels are going, and he was a very thoughtful guy, and he made a good lawyer that way. Didn't like to make sudden decisions, but kind of just sort of backtracking a little bit. Key people, when you think about looking back, and so you're so grateful that people did these things. Again, talking about my grandfather's brother, Albert, he took an interest in family genealogy and history right from as he was young. And and my dad remembers that Uncle Albert, they called him Uncle Bert, I should say. He was always Uncle Bert. He said, when I was a young guy, I didn't really, you go to these, he'd be telling us about family history and things he'd found about, because they married into the Green family and the Kimberly family and, this sort of thing. And they found it kind of boring. But, they understood, they appreciated he was doing it. But, as they get older, I don't think my Uncle Charles ever really cared that much. My dad he said, there's all this information. We have black book after black book. And he, and so the earliest one is about the Stephen Price guy, and he wanted to learn more about whatever Stephen Price did. And so what he did was, because remember there was 12 in that one family and 10 in another, so he had these maiden ladies, great aunts, whatever, that he would make a point of interviewing.
Wow.
And in the 1890s, when he was only in his, he would have been in his 20s, the late 20s, he was 1878, so probably more like, maybe he's more, I swear to God, I think they were like in the 1890s, when he'd make notes, let's say early 1900s. But he would look them up and he would interview them. And there's some of these stories, and you can't really corroborate them, but because he was asking about, because we don't know who the parents of Stephen Price were. We don't really have that nailed down. and how that all occurred. But here's one little story that one of the aunts told him that she had heard from somebody, right, from Stephen, because about his own. So here was a story that Stephen Price's parents, his father was an officer in the British Army. Stephen, we know he was born in 1758, which would have been during the French and Indian War. Okay, so it would have been natural for them to have soldiers, obviously, over here in New Jersey, whatever. And the story goes that Stephen Price's father, an officer in the British Army, was in a tavern with his buddies, and a coach pulls up, and a woman comes out with a babe in arms, hands it to him, and disappears forever. Now, maybe mythological, maybe an exaggeration about her, but she was gone. So how he was raised, who knows? We'd love to know how that worked. But he had stories like this. Another one was that she said, Stephen Price, yeah, he was in the Revolutionary War, but he also fought the Indians, right? They used, term Indians. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. But then I find out that it did make sense, because the Sullivan Campaign, which was in 1779, included, where George Washington, it's kind of, briefly, the story of that is, George Washington was getting tired of because most of the Seneca, or the Iroquois League was on the side of the British. I think it was only the Oneidas or somebody were on the side of the colonists, but they had a split. It was a real problem for the League, the Iroquois League, and Confederacy. But they, the ones that were basically on the British side were engaged in some pretty horrific, terrorizing of the settlements, killing, scalping, whatever, and it was interrupting the breadbasket of the colonies. New York State had this wonderful, obviously, ability to supply the army. So Washington decided once and for all to get rid of that problem, and he assigned, I think it was between 8,000 and 10,000 soldiers. General Sullivan, the guy he pointed, he says, you get 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers of different regiments, and I want you to go and I want you to take care of that problem. Go and burn the villages, basically, and confront the Indians and the Tories that were and the British that were fighting with the. So, turns out Stephen Price's he was in the 3rd Regiment of the New Jersey, Colonial Army, and was part of that. So they went, from New Jersey. In fact, I was on that road, just happened to be on that road from New Jersey up through Pennsylvania to, I'll say, Elmira area, and sure enough, there were all these historical markers. This was the Sullivan Campaign. This was the trail they took to get up, to confront there were some. I think they had some confrontations in northern Pennsylvania, but the main one was in Newtown, which when you're driving on 86, there's Newtown.
Yeah, I always wondered.
And there's if you stop and go up and look, there's some memorials up there. There's actually a Revolutionary War a graveyard for some people that might have lost their life in that engagement. It was a small engagement by our standards, but Sullivan was an excellent general, and he brought artillery. And so even though of course it was mostly Indians, natives, and some Tories and some British, but they weren't well supported. They just didn't really take it they just didn't spare a lot of people to fight. They were behind embankments or whatever. They were sort of fortified, but there's 8,000 or 10,000 troops. They overwhelmed them, and apparently they killed more than one, maybe 3 of their chiefs were killed in that battle, which is hugely devastating. Anyway, and then the Indians fled to Niagara Falls, where they were protected, and they abandoned their villages because they had overwhelming force. And it's sort of a sad story. We don't have to get into it, but where the troops went around, and their job was to burn those villages down, and all the crops. It was in August of 1779, and they were burning all these crops that were just ready to be harvested. And there were stick-built homes. It wasn't just teepees and things. It was amazing. Settlements had been there for a long time. So one of the quick thing, we all know where Horseheads is. Mm-hmm. You know why it's called Horseheads? Well, briefly, the Sullivan's army, of course, had horses galore, and they were going around doing all this and destroying all the food that otherwise they could have fed to the horses, right? They realized they overdid it. The horses got exhausted. They lost a lot of the horses in this thing before they headed back to New Jersey, and they left the horses there, and the ones that died, and it became like a horse graveyard in a way. And the Indians, when they came back down after the troops were gone, the Sullivan's army was long gone, Indians came back down to see what had happened, and of course were outraged what had happened. And the story goes, and I'm not sure it's completely corroborated, they lined up the skulls of the horses along the road, and it became known as horse heads, that the four corners, whatever. Well, anyway, so there was no question that Stephen was in on that. So the fact that these stories, these ladies were, these old aunts, yeah, I heard he fought the Indians, and there was one case where he and his friends they chased them, and they went over, they jumped over a cliff to get out of the way. I was like, myth, but maybe not. So, but Bert got all this stuff the best he could, which is kind of neat. He used to write to the DAR. He'd write to the government, try to get records. So he was the family archivist. He was the first one to have a camera. We have pictures from the early days. He took pictures like in 1902 of parties they went to, and he'd label who was there. We've got pictures of all this. we have a whole album of pictures that you can't identify, but he identified them very well. So he was a key person in my dad's life and my family's life. And I'm sorry I didn't get to know him, because he he was he was kind of like a Stanley Weeks.
Yeah.
A Masonic.
Yep.
What's that? 33.
32nd. Well, he might have been the 33rd. I mean, that's.
He was yeah, whatever he was. He got as high as you could go.
Well, there you go, 33rd.
And he. Pretty well as high as you could go without maybe the honorific, but he was a very active Mason. My grandfather had no interest in that, but Albert did. But he was again somebody that kept the records. We've got and then a lot of the genealogy I'm not going to pursue, but he had like he would do the collaterals, people that you married into, and he'd trace them back. And spent a lot of time on that sort of thing. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else to say about him. But it was just somebody that was important in the family life. I can't remember why I brought him up beyond that.
Well, the idea of what, in many senses, what we're doing here is preserving history. You sort of picked up the mantle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, my father, after he retired, sort of took an interest in this more than he had, and he not all the collaterals, but he kind of wanted to know the main trunk line, right? And started to be interested in collecting information, and turns out, it's amazing what people say. We have letters from Stephen Price that are pasted in these old books that he was able to preserve, from 1809. We have his pension records, because they did give him pensions eventually, but you had to apply for a pension. I went to the Cortland Historical Society and found his application, wow, which was like in 1820, or he died in 1831, and he had to list your worldly goods on an attached Schedule A, and I think he underestimated them. I think, or maybe he was very poor, but you had to say that it was need-based, right? And then after he died, his widow reapplied for the widow's pension from the Revolutionary War, soldier's pension. So that's sort of the family outline of how it all developed. We had this Wilson Charles sort of thing going on, and so Charlie, my Uncle Charlie, was Charles Harrison Price, and and then my cousin Chuck is Charles, and I think Charles. I'm not sure his middle name's Harrison, but so we have a lot of Charleses. And my dad was the first Sam, and now our family has Sams coming out of our ears. My brother Sam, I've got a couple of nephews Sam. I've got a grandson Sam. So Sam became a popular name after Big Sam. My dad was kind of known.
And to sort of wrap up a little bit on your thing, you went out of practice law, had an opportunity to be a general counsel for the Chautauqua Abstract Company. And
Right.
then subsequently was the president of the Abstract Company, weren't you?
Right. Yep. I was. You know, there's something called a Peter Principle, which that was a famous book back in the '60s, where you got to watch out not to get promoted to your level of incompetence. I've always loved examining titles. I'm pretty good at it. I mean, I really worked hard at it. And but in about 1992, I'd been with the company for just 10 years. And my boss, Connie Zenz, well, just backtrack a minute. I got to Chautauqua Abstract in 1982, and the manager at the time was Willard Morton, who was a wonderful guy and a great manager. He had started as manager in 1960, and he'd married the boss's daughter. His boss had been Clarence Page, who had taken over in 1939. In fact, the first manager was appointed in 1909 and was there for 30 years. Clarence Page was in there for 20 years, until 1921, until 1960, and Willard was there until, so by the time I got there, there'd only been 3 managers since 1909 of Chautauqua Abstract.
And by the way, for the record, the Chautauqua Abstract Company is a for-profit corporation owned by, at the time, just lawyers.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, just so you
right.
know.
Right. There was a well, what there was just there was something called the Buffalo Abstract Company came down, and because you needed to have somebody, the county clerk made searches in those days too, and so there was a side. Well, maybe we should have a private company. So there's a Buffalo Abstract Company, and then one of the incorporators of Chautauqua Abstract saying they got enough stockholders or interest was my grandfather. He was an incorporator of Chautauqua Abstract back in 1909, and he would have been a 34-year-old lawyer at the time. But he did a lot of real estate. I still see his stuff. Anyway, so in 1960, Willard took over as manager from Clarence Page, his father-in-law, and Connie Zenz was there as a long-established, title searcher, great title searcher. And Willard told me something interesting that I just remembered. He said that because my grandfather Wilson was on the board of Chautauqua Abstract, and this would have been when he was, I think, gosh, think about it, 1961, he was up there in years. He would have been 86 years old or something, but I think he still would go to board meetings. They like to do that kind of thing. I remember Bill Foley's dad, Al Foley, used to like to go to the board meetings, and he was great. So, but Willard, and this is what I don't remember, whether he had the actual letter still. I think he did, actually. This is 1982, and Willard had one more year before he retired. But he called me into his office one day and said, I've got something. I think he gave it to me. I'm ashamed to say I don't remember quite exactly, but he said he'd been there maybe a year as manager, and he got a letter from my grandfather, who was the chairman of the board, or on the board, probably is not honorary chairman of the board. And he wrote him a brief note saying how pleased they were, the board was, with Willard's performance, and that the fact they'd made a great choice in hiring him as the manager. And Willard kept that letter. So that was kind of neat when I heard about that. That was kind of thing my grandfather would have done. So Willard was there and in 1982, and very accommodating, wonderful. In fact, I got there and I was so new as a lawyer. I'll be honest, when I got hired by Chautauqua Abstract, it was July of 1982, I couldn't sleep the night before I started, really very well, because I was like, I'm a fraud. I don't know anything. I mean, I've had, real estate. I mean, I've had handle a couple of transactions, and I've been trained at, I've gone to law school, and I know, but will I really be able to examine titles effectively? And, you felt, it's almost like you feel a little bit of what's the word? Like it's the word for that, where you feel like it's a little bit of imposter syndrome. I think it's normal, but I got there, and Willard put me at my ease. He's it's going to be great, and we're glad to have you. So one of the things I did, though, I asked him to supply me with a library. So he actually built a bookcase for me, and he bought me Warren's Weed treatises on real estate. It was 14 volumes.
Yep.
And I said, well, it's expensive because you have to keep up the pocket parts in those days, and it's an annual charge. They say don't sell razors, sell razor blades, right? Sell the pocket parts, right? So, but he didn't hesitate. He said, whatever you need. So I got 14 volumes of Warren's Weed, real estate and law, and maybe the great famous Green Book, maybe at that point, the Pedowitz book on real estate titles in New York State. And fortunately, when I started in '82, it turned out to be fortunate. The business was slow. It was during a recession. And so I adopted the practice, a rare burst of diligence on my part, that after lunch every day, I would read a chapter of Warren's Weed on one of the topics that I thought I'd on the law of deeds, law of mortgages, the law of mortgage foreclosures, the law of tax foreclosures, easements, that sort of thing. And I kept notes. And so I had a whole drawer full of notes, because every day we'd say I'd maybe spend an hour or two after lunch, because it was not that busy. But then '83 came, and so and the '80s turned out to be pretty vibrant time for real estate, particularly the secondary market started to kick in, and all of a sudden everyone needed title insurance, right? So I was very busy and very happy. We had plenty of work. And then Willard retired, and here was the thing that is always tricky in a company, I think, and especially a small company. What's the succession plan? Willard had been there for 23 years and was he was this legendary guy. He was a great manager. He kept charts, of production. And my friend Brian Abbott, who was unfortunately passed away in 2020, he was a title searcher and trained title searcher. And typically a title searcher, it takes the rule of thumb was about 1.5 years before you're fully fledged, can be on your own and just do searches without being double checked by someone more experienced. And Brian told me the story that, because Brian was very careful and sort of nervous, he was going to make a mistake, which is normal. And so 1.5 years came, and Willard said, go for it, right? And a couple months later, Willard called him down to the office, and Brian went in and was like, oh gosh, am I in trouble? He said, look, he showed him the charts. He said, you're not producing anything here. He said, what's the problem? And Willard knew the problem. Well, so maybe not. He said, Willard said, look, you've been trained. We have total confidence in you. Go make me some searches. And Brian said it was like a watershed moment for him, because then he went out and he said, by that point he said, okay, and that was kind of that's a manager for you, to know when to do that to somebody. So then, but the problem was Willard left, and who's going to do this? Who's going to be manager, right? And they told Connie, you got to be a manager. And Connie was, I call him the Babe Ruth or Hank Aaron of title searchers. He was born to do this stuff, and he was so good at it. He's one of those people that was fitted to the profession that he chose so well. But you got to be a manager, and managing is different functions than production, right? And he didn't like it, and didn't know personnel issues, whatever. Then he would devolve stuff on me. I'm the lawyer. He said, should we have a 401k plan? Should we do this? Should we do that? You decide. So you'd have me decide. And I'd bring in salespeople and or investment advisors, and I did a lot of that. And I didn't mind doing that kind of thing. But so he didn't like it. So we were driving to a board meeting one day, like it's about after maybe 10 years. He did it for 10 years. It looks like we're maybe quite. Willard got it 83, so not quite. And he said, how would you like to be manager? I said, I'm fed up. He said, you don't want to be a manager. So long story short, I agreed. So I became manager, I think in '92. And then of course, when you're manager, you're also president, and for what it's worth. But you're really the manager, because and I was there until 2000, when we had a parting of the ways. And I'll admit, I didn't like being a manager either. And I think what happened, they needed a real manager type, and they did get one in John Ortendahl, who was a outstanding title guy, and but he also had managerial skills. He was able to wrap his arms around that. So in 2000, I left KCO, and then the following year, in February of 2001, I was hired by Public Abstract Company to start a branch office in Mayville. They had 9. I became the 10th branch office. Public Abstract was a large agency in Rochester for First American. And And that was and that was really due to my friend Frank Carroll, who was working for Public at the time and promoted me. He said, why don't you have an agency in Mayville? And they listened to him, and Frank was absolutely instrumental in getting me set up and getting me launched. So I was there for 5 years, and then we had a very amicable parting of the ways, and I just, the solution was, to our disagreement was, why don't you, Price, take over the agency and privatize it. I was the first there were 10 branches, I was the first to do that. And it was like a domino effect. A bunch of others decided to do that because the corporation, Public had been purchased in 2004 by First American. So now they had a big Fortune 500 company, which has sort of a heavy overlay, when you're on little small branches and you've got to do things a certain way. I tell the story that with First American, when I was now an agency for First American, their invoice was 18 pages long. So you had to figure out, what your products were. So anyway, a lot of people want to do what I did, which was privatize it. So I became Price Abstract in July of 2006. And now it's going to be 20 years as Price Abstract this July. And that's basically it. I've had Price Abstract. I'm the only lawyer there. But I've had, so I hired title searchers and typists and office manager, and you have to be, if you're an agent, you have to be an agent for certain underwriters, and I've got 2, but that's just a sort of a title guy. In our area, as we know, attorneys do the closings. They're the settlement agents, thank goodness. And so the title, someone like me, is, I call it being sort of like the under the hood person, right? So person that's sort of supposed to be on top of the title law and new developments sort of thing. But so that's it. I know more about real estate titles than I should. Almost approaching what I know about the New York Yankees pre-1970.
Well, you know both of those very well. Curious, you obviously had your law degree throughout. You were working at a firm for a couple of years, private firm. Did you ever get dragged into court? Were you ever a law guardian? Did they ever reel you in? Did you ever have any of that?
While I was in the private?
Or anytime?
Well,
Did they ever drag you
no,
in?
not really. But what was kind of interesting, just one couple quick stories like that, was I remember I was walking up the street one day when it was back in 1981 when I was in private practice with my, it was Price Flowers Mill in Westerberg, and I was, new there. But before that, I'm going to tell you a family story. This I found wonderful. My first day of work, which would have been like sometime in January or in 1980, got out of law school in 1979. My wife Barbie and I went on a 4-month European junket, spent most of our savings, and then came back and lived with my parents for 2 years, and it worked out great. They were fully behind us, which I always appreciated. So I didn't get back to town from that junket until December, and then he said, okay, why don't you start for me in January? So I get all dressed up in my suit. I get in the car with my dad, living with my parents, and he said, let's stop and see your grandma, his mother, Theo, on Crosman. Just stop in and see how she's doing, and we can show her that you're going to work for your first day. So we go up there. My grandmother's still having her coffee in bed and sitting up, and my dad were chatting a little bit, and she says, "Oh, Sam," she says, "aren't you so pleased that Tommy's coming to work for you?" And here's what my dad said, which was very much my dad. She said, "Mom, somehow the weight of the world just did not leave my shoulders." In other words, I've got some training. He's not going to be contributing quite yet, right? And I thought it was great. So that was, that was that. Oh, then, okay, so I start working, and you make rookie mistakes. I remember one of my first real estate transactions, Dad's like, here's a file, sort of follow this file. And you're supposed to send a proposed deed to the buyer's attorney and tax receipts, in those days it was quite simple, right? And I sent what I thought was the proposed deed. I saw a carbon in the sample file, and I prepared something. I don't know what it was really, but I got a call from the attorney who was chuckling and said, "How about a legal description?" I said, oh, that would be good. And I even got a call from Tubi Scarpino once that, and of course he was always grouchy about, I mean, he was trying to teach you a lesson, right? And no, it wasn't Tubi. Tubi gave me a hard time about something else, but I think it was Bud Wright, and he was very nice about it. I'd done some sort of a title opinion or what we needed, and Bud Wright called me and said, did you look at that abstract carefully? And I said, I thought I did. He said, take a look at it again. There's that final page there. It might have been sticking together, but there was federal tax lien there. We might want to take it. And I either blew by it or didn't know. So, I made rookie mistakes. That's why it's nice being on a firm, so you're not out hanging out to dry. But anyway, I'm walking down the street, and somebody yells across, forget which attorney, says, hey, Tom, I see you're a referee in a foreclosure. That's great. Get a few, you get a little. I said, I am. I didn't know I was. And so I went and looked in the paper. He said, yeah, it's in the paper today. You're the referee. So I went and looked in the paper, and it was a mortgage foreclosure being handled by Jim Westman. So I called Jim's office, and I said, Jim, am I the referee in this foreclosure? Aren't I supposed to know that I'm the referee? And he said, I forgot to tell you, whatever. So that was, you used to get a little fee for that, but I was like, gosh, but I never got a law guardianship. But so once I got into the title world, what could happen was you could get called as an expert witness, on a title problem. I never did, but there was a really interesting case, real briefly, that happened. And there was there's a place called Oriental Park. And on the map of Oriental Park from the 1890s, there's something called the Oriental Grove. And it's got trees drawn in. And, well, of course, it was the developer laid out the lots. They were sold, but nothing ever happened to the so-called grove, right? So the original developer moved out to New York City or someplace. I remember his name was Woodward. And by 1927 was out of it. And so eventually the grove was given a tax parcel number and was put on the as delinquent taxes. Someone bought it. It was 6.8 acres, I remember. And someone was getting ready to do something with it. And the people started saying, wait a minute, I thought that was a park. Is a grove a park? So anyway, long story short, Phil Erickson was on one side, and he told his clients, why don't you go over there and have a weenie roast? Because it's a common area. So so it got people really upset, saying, wait a minute, I thought we could build on this thing. It was a beautiful piece of property. And so the search was made by somebody who no longer was with the abstract company, and they hadn't made clear that it was, they just put the tax parcel number as a description, right? So the senior title searcher at the time was Brian Abbott. So I sat down with Brian and said, you're going to call you as an expert witness here about, and he was shaking his boots. He's like, I'm going to get cross-examined by who? So long story short, it was settled out of court. So I've never had to testify. I was asked by an attorney once if I would be a special master in a title dispute, but apparently to do that, you had to get the consent of both sides, and the other side didn't want me to do that for some reason. So I've never had to go to court.
So to kind of wrap this up,
Yeah.
You did get married, you do have family. We should have a little personal side of this.
Sure. I met my future bride in college. We went to Denison University. We both graduated in the 70s. Well, graduated in 74, class of 74. But my wife, who's was very diligent in her academics and in her planning, left college after 3.5 years. She had all her credits, became a teacher, and so she left. We met we knew each other, but we started going out in the fall of our senior year in 73. And actually brought her to Jamestown then and introduced her to chicken wings, things like that. But so she went back to Dayton in January of where she was from, and taught school, lived with her parents. I graduated in due course in 74 and planned to go to seminary for 2 years to study theology, as I said, in Rochester. And that summer we got engaged. And we got married on January 3rd, 1975. So we're 51 years in. And so we got married in 75, and I was finishing seminary, got out of seminary in 76. And in the spring of that year, we went looking at law schools. And as soon as we drove up the main drag of Washington Lee, we said, this is the place, because it's great. It's a National Historic Monument. If you've ever been to Lexington, Virginia, it's amazing, beautiful place. So we went there for 3 years, got out in 79. As I said, that she was teaching this whole time, taught in Lexington, and came back to Jamestown and started teaching. So we started having children in 81. Our oldest daughter, Pi, is born in 81. Then we had Marky in 83, Penfield in 85, Coco in 1990, 4 kids, now up to 12 grandchildren. They're spread out over, as we know, over this court. They're not living locally. I've got one in LA, one in Florida, one in DC, and one in Savannah, Georgia. So very fortunate. She's a retired teacher. Barbie retired in 2022. And the following year, she gave the commencement address in the amphitheater, which was she did a great job. She was a great teacher. I mean, she's kind of like my old boss, Connie Zenz, who was so fitted to be a title searcher, just so good at it. And I always thought that of all the people I've met in the top, could count on one hand or one, people that were just so good at their profession and loved it. She always said she liked getting out of bed and going to work. She loved teaching, and she was a great high school English teacher. She really was. She was. I can't tell how many people that just going, you go into a department store and you'll talk to, oh, you're Barbie's husband, and they have a story about their child and what she'd meant to their student. And so on. So and we're living up in the town of Chautauqua. We were in Jamestown up until 2012. So very happy, very fortunate, and that's my story.
And a good one. Oh, by the way, Barbie became one of the most proficient ice skating judges.
Right.
I mean,
right.
So when she dives into something, she dives.
Well,
into
she was. She became a national figure skating judge, and just briefly there, she always liked to skate. And when she came to Jamestown, we have this great rink, Now this was the one, Allen Park at the time, not the one downtown here, and she got into a group, Jean Cadieux and Walker, I forget her first name.
Betsy
Betsy Walker, and then her mom. There was a really great skating family, organization and local group. And so she skated, and she even competed a little bit. But she realized that to really pursue that, you have to start leaping in the air and doing jumps and spins. And she said, she didn't really enjoy that part. She liked doing the figures, which were sort of going out of style in a way. But so she said, well, I like skating so much, I'll learn to be a judge. And so she got trained as a figure skating judge, and she never got to, let's say, Olympic category, but she was a national judge. You go to national competitions, got to know those judges, and did that for years. And in fact, she developed so many frequent flyer miles, we got a free trip to Europe in 1993 out of it. So anyway, so that's her. She's and also, in teaching, she was not just English, but another thing to note is that she was a public speaking teacher, and she actually said she really got to love that as much as teaching English, teaching kids to be able to speak in public and read poetry and that sort of thing. She was in the so-called Poetry Out Loud national program that she had put in place at the high school. So she was, and again, the key to her profession was that she liked that age group. Not everyone likes high school kids. That age group there can be difficult, but she had a great knack, has a great knack for that age group. So we've been. It's funny. One other thing. We loved being in Virginia for law school, and we have a sort of a joke that it was always mostly a joke, was that, or at least between us, a little source of joshing is that I took her from the Blue Ridge Mountains, Virginia, and this beautiful setting in Virginia, Lexington, Virginia, and brought her to Jamestown, which has the winters that we know about, and it was different. And she claims that I said, and I probably did, that just 5 years. Just 5 years. Then they get settled as an attorney, then we'll go right back to wherever you want to go. So here we are, all these years later. But she says right now she wouldn't want to live anywhere else. She says it's, when she goes like to Florida or to DC or even to, to LA and the traffic and the nonsense, she says if you can live in Chautauqua County and make a living here, she says it's idyllic. So she's come around. It took 51 years, but she's happy.
Well, I'm happy that you're happy, that she's happy. And I'm delighted you came in today. This is
Thanks,
fabulous.
Pete. Thanks, Pete. I enjoyed it.
This is great. Thank you.
Take care.